Hello everyone. In this video, I am going to cover some of the miscellaneous as well as advanced security features in Data Entity Framework. In the previous video on Data Entity Framework, I showed an overview of how to use data entity and create a form-based application on top of that data entity. In this video, I'm going to show some of the features which work alongside the data entity. So before I start talking about data entity, one of the things I wanted to talk about is permission control. So data entity comes with a very granular permission control system. So if you go to Manage Center, under Application Management, there is Permissions. When you click on it, one of the blocks over there you will see is Entity Permissions. When you click on it, it shows you two kind of global roles which are available for entities. One is Entity Designer, another one is Entity Global Permission Manager. Now, by default, when you do an installation or a new tenant is pinned up, the tenant admin is the one who is going to have access to this screen. Then he can go in and add additional entity designers. So anyone who is in this group is the one who will be able to access this screen, the data entity screen. If he is not in that group, he would not be able to get in. Secondly, the second thing is Entity Global Permission Manager. Anyone who is added to this group would be able to manage the permissions of an entity, where they can go in and in a bulk assign read-write permissions or even edit delete permissions to an entity, which you will see later in my demo. So this is in a way a gateway into data entity. So by default, as I said, only tenant admin will have access to this section, and they can then go in and add additional people over here, entity designers and entity global permission managers. And once a person is in Entity Global Permission Manager, they can add additional people from this screen as well. Okay, so with that out of the way, we are going to head into data entity. So as you can see, it is available from within Build Apps. You can click on Data Entity button, takes you to this screen. So as you can see, the home screen has changed a little bit. There is a nicer looking home page image. There's some statistics around it. There are out of the box 95 entities which are available and 207 pick lists. In fact, actually 94 standard entities. I have one custom entity over here. So it tells me all that kind of distribution right over here. Apart from that, you will have a section called recently modified entities. You can bookmark an entity as a favorite entity, which you can use quickly. Click over here to get into that entity and do the same for pick list. With this release, we have opened pick list as well. Pick list is nothing but a collection of records, just like list of countries or list of regions, which we'll see later in the demo. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate, as I said, on more of miscellaneous items, but I'm going to still show you if some things have changed on the entity screen. So I'm going to say my test entity I can give it a category, say maybe human resources. Let's say primary key column is name. I'll mark it as published. One new thing which has been introduced is what is the maximum number of rows you want to be fetched from data entity when a view or a API call is being made. Now, by default, we have set it to 1000, but you can increase it, of course. And whether the entity is active or not, which you saw probably in the previous demo, you can enable event logging. And this is the new setting which has come in, which is whether you want to enable entity permission for this particular entity, and you will say yes. And you can also say allow import export of models and as well as data, and create entity. So a couple of properties, the number of rows and the permission property, they were the new ones, and you can keep adding more rows as we go. Now, one of the things that you might notice is entities internal name. Now this is, we are following all those famous entity frameworks. The internal name, if I have created a custom entity, is always having a suffix of __u. If I'm creating a custom relationship, it will have a suffix of __r. Any custom fields I create, whether in standard entity or custom entity, the internal name, the display name will be proper, but internal name would be __u. This is done so that at an API level, you can very quickly identify which ones are custom fields and which ones are not. Similarly, for a custom pick list, it will be __p, which we'll see later. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to step back into one of the custom entities which I had already created. So you see it's an entity called employee, and it has a bunch of 5-6 fields over here. No relationships. I kept it simple, where I showed all the relationship concept in my previous video. I have 2 rows over here which are added. So let's go ahead and first talk about import export. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this and say export this entity as a template. And it gives me an option whether you want to export it as a JSON or an XML. I'm going to export it as JSON. So as you can see, it exported it as a JSON so that I can import it in another environment. Similarly, I can even export the data as well. So I can say all the rows in this particular entity, export it as JSON. So once I have exported it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home screen from here. I'm going to show you some features right over here. I just wanted to take a backup of that entity before I kind of deleted it. So I'm going to first, before I show other operations, one is we have provided additional search options. So you can search an entity by name, you can search an entity by category, and search an entity by type. Search by name is the default. So for example, if I wanted to search the one starting with employee, I can do that. Or I can say search by category. I want to search everything in person category. Similarly, I can say search by type, anything which is custom. So you can see the 2 custom entities came up. Similarly, there is a group by option. So I can say group by category. So it groups all the available entities by categories, or group by type. So it groups by custom and standard entities, or group by owner. So if there are multiple owners, so for example, I have 2 owners. These are all standard entities. These are the ones created by user called Nishant Beta. So it groups by owners. Similarly, there are filter options as well. So I can filter over here by type, which is standard or custom, filter by active status, which is active or inactive, or published status, which is published or draft. So I can say show me only the custom ones. So it only filters down to custom, and because this is highlighted, it tells me there is a custom filter. I can go in and clear it as well. Next, okay, so I'm going to delete my employee entity. Remember, the employee entity had some group of columns as well as some data records in there. Now, before I show you that feature, one thing I wanted to mention is under settings, if you go to app builder, there is a new category called data entity. Under that, you can see 2 permissions, whether you are allowed to delete the entity or not. So if by default it is no, so you can turn it to yes and click save. Similarly, you can define your custom categories over here as well. So these are out of the box categories, but you can add your own custom categories as well. Now coming back, once I have selected that allow deletion of entities, I select my entity and click delete entity. So it asks me whether I want to delete it. I'll say yes. And as you can see, my employee entity is deleted. What I'm going to do next is, because I took a backup of that, I'm going to say import template, select a file, and I'm going to import the metadata of it and click import. So it tells me the template has been imported successfully and all the columns which I originally had are all still maintained. Now next, if I go to the data tab, it is empty right now because I never imported the records yet. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want to import the data as well. I'm going to select the second JSON file, say import. So as you can see, it brought down the two records which I had over here. Next, what I'm going to show you is, since we are in the data tab, you can see over here, I can obviously view and edit the record. And because I had one of the columns I'm right now viewing it, I'm going to click on edit. One of the columns was of type pick list. It shows me that thing as a drop down. So I can do this, or I can just clone a record as well. So I can say clone a record. Let's change it to something else and click clone. So as you can see, the records can be cloned over here. Similarly, an entity itself can be cloned as well. So we can just say clone entity. The new one would be called employee underscore demo. So if I go to the fields, you can see all the fields were maintained in this custom entity. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my employee entity over here. Okay. Next, you also have an option of navigating to other entity right from here. Instead of having to go back to the menu, you can actually go in, and it's just a convenience feature where you can actually just click on the entity right from here and navigate to the new entity. So I don't have to. So as you can see, I went back to the employee demo, or I want to go back to employee, I can come back. So it's just a convenience navigation feature. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is security. I already talked about relationship and data in my previous video, but let's look at security, which is the main concept over here. So you can enable the security over here, and once the security has been enabled, there are 6 entity level security groups which you will find. One is called entity owner. This is the person who is the owner of this entity and who can give other people permission to use the entity or change the permissions as such. And he will have all the controls as mentioned in the text. He will have full permissions for this entity: add, delete, modify, manage permissions, etc. Entity designer, if you add a person to this role, he would be the one who can add and edit the or alter the metadata of an entity. He can add more columns, delete columns. Similarly, so the first 2 are the design time permissions and the other 4 are runtime permissions. So you can anybody who is in the read record group can read the records from this entity in list view. Edit record, as name suggests, can edit the records. Create record can create a new record, and delete record can delete a record. In order to add a person to a particular role, all you have to do is click on it and you can add members and search for it and keep adding them. There is one more tab which has been added, which is associations. Now, typically people struggle with this kind of a concept that if an entity has been used in say 20 different applications, they wanted to know the impact analysis if they are going to modify an entity. What we have done is we have made that easier. So any application this entity is being used in is automatically shown over here from an impact analysis perspective. So you can very quickly see that this entity was referenced in 20 different applications. So that's what this tab is going to do. Okay, next we are going to talk about bulk security assignment. So remember, anyone who is in the global entity permission manager group will be able to access this fourth menu option over here, where you can assign permissions in bulk. So you can look at the user or group from here. You can search for it, and it will show you the permissions of that user, and you can then quickly change it. You can say that, okay, you have you can select the check boxes. So for example, if I don't want to give him an owner permission, I want to just give him designer and delete permission, or maybe other permissions as well. So I can quickly select individual ones if I want to. So I can assign it for multiple entities in bulk for a particular user. Okay, next we are going to look at pick list. Now pick list has a similar concept to entities, but as I said, you can create a collection of data elements out there. So for example, if I had to create a pick list, I'll say my pick list, and click save, and I can start adding line items. So item 1, item 2, and so on. So I can keep adding it. So it's just like a collection of predefined values which you can add. You can edit a pick list, you can delete pick list, you can import, export, clone pick list, same kind of concept as data entity. You can mark it as favorite. So if you mark it as favorite over here, and you go back to the home page, you see that shows in the pick list. Now next, what I'll do is I'm going to use that pick list in one of my entities. As I said, my employee entity had one of the columns called region, and that was of type pick list. I'm going to show you how it works at runtime. So I'm going to go ahead and go to build apps. And say add an app, form-based application. I'll call it employee demo. I'll select data source as data entity. Give it a nice data source name. I just want to see custom entities. You have seen all this in past demos, so I'm going to select custom entity called employee, and here are the different fields available. There are no related entities because I didn't create a relationship. I'm going to go ahead and click finish. So it tells me my application has been generated. I'm going to design my new form. I'm going to drag and drop name, age. By the way, one of the things you saw is that if I selected the data source as of type data entity and I'm dragging and dropping these things, it didn't pop up the dialog where it asked me to select the control type, compatible control type, which you see in Salesforce and some of the other data sources. The reason is because while defining the data entity, I already defined the column of type text or phone or email, so I already know the type. So it intelligently maps it automatically for you. Region. Now you see region by default got added as a drop down. Now I could do it as radio buttons and other things. I can drag and drop from here and then drag and drop the entity or the node on top of it. I can do that, but by default it is selected as a drop down. And it did one thing for me. If I put it in edit mode and go to configure, you see that it automatically said the list type is of type pick list instead of inline predefined or lookup, which you used to see in past. Is a new type called pick list, and it automatically associated with the proper pick list, which was region. So I didn't have to do any configuration. It automatically figured all that thing out. Phone to phone. email to email, and address would be a text area. Pretty standard stuff which you have seen in the past demo. And if I preview it, you can see that the region dropdown was populated from my pick list, which was defined in data entity as well. Now I can go ahead and publish this and consume it from my work center, which you have seen in the previous demo. So I'm going to skip that part. Thanks a lot for your time.